That's the conversation that's going to happen next. It will be moderated by Hasnayn Ebrahim, who's the Managing Director for the Africa International Advisors. Merlon Aldiarov, who is Infrastructure Program Leader at the World Bank. Simpwe Yankis, who's the head for East, Central and West Africa for the Development Bank of South Africa, as well as Bernard Magoro, who is the head of the Independent Power Producers Office in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa. Aldi Kafafi, who's the Vice President for Africa and New Ventures at Taka Arabia, and Carlos Torres Diaz, who's the Senior Vice President and the Global Head of Renewables and Power at Rystad Energy. Again, thank you very much to our panel for joining us, and yeah, do take it away. Enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for those who came out to listen to us. I know quite late in the day. I imagine some of you may even be suffering from a bit of jet lag, but really thank you for taking the time to engage with us this afternoon. My name is Hasnayn Ebrahim. I'm the Managing Director at Africa International Advisors. And really, I think the topic is really quite pertinent for a couple of reasons. I think the first one is that we recognize that significant investment must occur to drive this energy transition, and that is largely going to be driven towards electrification across the electricity and power value chains, and that we need private participation in order to drive scale, drive speed, and drive execution efficiency. And so with that in mind, when we look at the issue of market liberalization, when we look at the issue of attracting private capital and skills into infrastructure development, I think, what are the levers that are available to us that can allow us to maintain the momentum, increase speed, and ultimately realize the delivery objectives that we are seeking to realize. I think if we have to look at the role of independent power producers from an investment perspective, I think we can largely agree that they are going to be pivotal to this. And so what this panel will explore over the next hour is how can Africa expedite the development of power projects through diverse energy sources, leveraging private capital and expertise to enhance the reliability and sustainability of energy supply. And I think some of the topics that we'll look at is examining the investment climate, the regulatory capacity, looking at the legal frameworks, the scaling and pace of investments, and ultimately the strategic partnerships. I really am joined by an esteemed panel, beginning with Carlos Torres, SVP of Global Head of Renewables and Power for Rystad. I think what I'm going to do is, as we go through the introductions, if you could introduce yourselves, yes. And just offer perhaps some introductory remarks on the topic at hand. Carlos.
Perfect. Well, thanks for the introduction, and great to be here. So yeah, my name is Carlos. I'm heading power research at Rystad Energy. We're a consulting and strategy analysis firm. And what we're forecasting for Africa is that demand will be growing substantially over the next 25 years, from around 1,000 terawatt hours today to more than 3,000 terawatt hours today. Obviously, this will require a lot of power generation capacity that needs to be developed if there's the right conditions to attract the projects. So we're forecasting around 600 gigawatts of solar capacity needed, 300 gigawatts of wind, plus remaining capacity from coal and gas. So then it will be interesting to explore what are the contractual terms that these projects will need to be able to move ahead in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carlos.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Merlon Aldiarov. I'm Infrastructure Program Lead from the World Bank. I am currently and have been based in South Africa for the last year or so. But this time, I'm one of those who is suffering from jet lag because I'm coming straight from Washington attending the annual meetings. And there have been quite a few bilateral, very interesting discussions. One of them has been about investing in energy in Africa. And one key message that we are finding is that if our ultimate objective is electrifying Africa, is that we are significantly off track of reaching it. And we have to triple our efforts in investments in electrifying. And electrifying is not only about connections, but also making sure that electrons are in those wires that we connect. And that requires a huge amount of resources. And not only resources, but also expertise, innovations that we hope and we believe that private sector can bring. So this topic is really, really relevant. I know that it is about IPPs, which I presume talks about the generation and private sector in generation, but I do hope that we will have a little bit of conversation across the value chain of energy beyond the generation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simpiwe Yanchis, currently heading up East Central and West Africa for the DBSA, which is the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Just for those who are not aware in the audience, so DBSA has a balance sheet of about 7 billion. 60% of those investments are in South Africa and 40% outside of South Africa. So we pretty much have invested in the entire continent. In the SADC region, we cover about 15 countries. Outside of SADC, about 26 countries. Very important topic for us, as I've just identified that we work across the continent and we are constantly challenged by or see the challenges of the debt burden of your sovereigns, who traditionally are supposed to be providing power to their citizens. And therefore, because the burdens from a sovereign debt perspective and also the fiscal space is quite constrained, the role of IPPs, it cannot be overemphasized. So this is one area that as a DBSA we want to support. We've constantly supported within South Africa and in the rest of the continent.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bernard Magoro. I'm the head of the IPP office in South Africa. The topic is also very relevant for us, and I think I will argue that it's even more relevant given that the dynamics in South Africa have changed significantly in the last 2 years. So we've been running the IPP program for the past 14 years. And in the last 2 years, if I can just mention some of the changes, we've run out of the grid. So we've got a lot of projects that are waiting for the grid in the northern and Western Cape area. The demand is in the north and the rest of the country. So grid is our number one challenge. And the question is, how do we then keep the momentum in the adverse times of where the grid is so scarce? The other one is exactly what Simpiwe mentioned. We have seen a reform in South Africa. The president has signed legislation now to drive towards a competitive market for electricity. And so the program has to now find its way amid the fact that we will be introducing the electricity market in the country. So maintaining that momentum. And then the third element is obviously with liberalizations, the industrial customers are now also able to procure their own energy. And at the same time, we must also make sure that there's energy security through our office. So yeah, a lot of challenges, but I think for now I'll just leave it here, pose those questions, and then we'll deep dive into how do we solve this need to keep the momentum in the IPP space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? I'm Adli Kafafi, I'm the Vice President for TOCA Arabia. TOCA Arabia have been established 20 years ago, especially for Africa, to invest in infrastructure to help the African countries utilize their own resources. So 20 years ago, we started the investment in infrastructure for the distribution of natural gas. We were able to connect more than 2 million clients with natural gas. That includes residential, commercial, and industrial clients, power stations. We invested as well in the electricity distribution. We were able to develop more than 1,500 megawatt of capacities to distribute electricity around Egypt for industrial purposes, for commercial, for touristic purposes. We invested as well in petroleum products. We invested in central storage. We invested in green hydrogen and water desalination, and so many other things. So we are basically an investment. Today we're focusing on Africa. So we started with Egypt. And from Egypt we went to Tanzania, and from Tanzania to Mozambique. But what we've seen that there is, I wouldn't say that everyone knows that we have a big deficit in energy in Africa. And we have seen examples today as we speak. The electricity generated in Nigeria, as an example, the current existing electricity generated is equal to the consumption of video games in the United States. So there is a huge lack and demand. That's everyone knows. But the problem, I would see from our point of view, we have another big problem, which is mainly that even the generated electricity that we have today, most of it is not that efficient. Yeah, and you see how many mines do we have in Africa? How do they get their energy? So HFO, so what is the efficiency for even generating this kind of electricity? So we would have done much more better if we have proper generation. We have GE with us in the room, so they would have proposed a lot of things. But we use HFO, we use diesel, we use LPG, which is today they are extremely expensive. And we would have much more better if we invested in infrastructures that would utilize natural gas or even renewable energy to generate the needed electricity. So that's
fantastic. Thank you all for those introductory remarks. I think we've seen let's call it the dimensioning of the problem at hand, or the situation at hand, and the challenges that we ultimately would need to overcome in order to maintain some of the momentum that, on the one hand, we've created quite successfully at the very least, places like South Africa with the IPP program, but to recognize that this is a very dynamic and evolving situation. I think perhaps to begin with you, Carlos, because I think the point that you touched on around demand is actually quite significant, right? So you're going to drive electrification. Electrification is going to, both by virtue of the fact that the African continent is energy poor, we need increased energy access, and by virtue of that, demand is going to increase. Electrification of sectors such as mobility and so forth is going to increase demand. But what do you see as being the fundamental drivers of energy demand growth, and where is that growth likely to be provided for from a supply perspective?
Yeah, well, in the short term, I think the focus should be on increasing the availability of electricity, especially in Central Africa. There's regions countries that have less than 60% penetration of electricity. So giving access to electricity should be one of the priorities. But then focusing on energy security, making sure that there's stable supply, so then that also requires more infrastructure. And in the longer term, obviously, we can start focusing more on the decarbonization, right, of the industrial sector, for example, on the residential sector. So then that will require more electricity growth, or higher electricity intensity that will be driving the demand in the longer term. So I think this will be the three main sources of demand growth. And well, this will require a lot of infrastructure, as it has already been discussed, not only on the generation side, but on the transmission also. But I mean, At the moment, we see that the cost of renewables has dropped substantially. So now the LCOEs of solar and wind are reaching close to 50. So then it makes sense to develop a lot of renewable capacity. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, we also need to provide energy security, right? So then we need to continue operating coal plants to some extent, increasing gas infrastructure to be able to provide this stable supply, and also sources that can help like provide stability to the system when the renewables are not functioning.
Fantastic, thank you. If we keep it on a, let's call it a regional basis, we recognize there are regional dynamics, regional characteristics that are at play. Yet when we often design or plan for our energy systems, it's often done from a national perspective, right? And so there's national dynamics, and we're trying to solve for regional dynamics, and it becomes quite complicated to do such things and introduce private participation in a regional conversation when there are real national interests that at play. But Mirlan, going to you and recognizing that there is an increased focus to drive certain regional integrated agendas, looking at the dynamics that it's not just a pure generation story. There's adjacent requirements in terms of transmission infrastructure and so on and so forth that needs to be in place. What can be done from a policy perspective, maybe regulatory perspective, in order to potentially unlock these opportunities that may be regional in nature, but by virtue of how we've approached energy planning, energy security, have limited our ability to really capture that opportunity?
No, thank you, Hasnayn. I'm glad that you are bringing this regional dimension, and especially since we sit in South Africa, we are also in the middle of the most developed regional power pool in Africa, SAP, Southern Africa Power Pool. And it is especially a mechanism that I think can help, and we collectively need to utilize more to leapfrog certain development challenges that we face in here. I like to bring an example of Namibia, for example, which has a top-notch globally renewable energy resources. And there are various estimates. The current estimate, one of the estimates that I have seen, is about 7 gigawatts of renewables, world-class solar energy. Yet the system itself is about 600 megawatt installed capacity. So for Namibia own purposes, even taking into account that it's only about 62% of electrification, it may require another 100, 200 max renewables, and that will be enough to meet the own domestic demand. But that is not going to give and to harness the potential of Namibia for the benefit of the whole region. And that's, I think, where the whole this access and electrification issue, which is already difficult at the national level, is kind of adding another level of complexity when we talk regionally. Having said that, I think there are three main elements that need to be addressed irrespective. You mentioned policy and regulatory environment, which we call in the bank, in the World Bank, we call enabling environment as an overall. And this is an important element. It is maybe most important element, but it's only one element. And what is important, I think, is not to forget the two other elements of it. One is ensuring that there is a good, robust pipeline of bankable projects. And the second one is that the financing needs to come. We keep talking about, at the previous one of the sessions over here, they talked about lack of clarity from the private sector, or rather the concern from the private sector about the lack of clarity of the policies, which basically brings us to the need of long-term planning with proper data, with quality data inputs in it. It also talked about the lack of managing and mitigating risks of offtake, which brings us to the issue of the need of having operationally sound, financially sound utilities. That is not the case in many of our countries here. And the third is also kind of mechanics of bringing and blending the financing. And that is, I think, where substantial role of institutions like the World Bank, my colleagues from other development banks, come in as the driving engines who can try to bring some concessional financing to blend with the public financing and private sector financing to scale up this financing. But again, this financing is not coming unless two other elements are in place.
Absolutely. Now, I think those are really fantastic and important points, right? So I think the issue of regional integration that can drive or that can unlock these opportunities, the renewable opportunities, but you need an enabling environment in place, and you need the right people to be playing the right roles, and specifically on the financing side, and which really then gets me to your point, or to the question that I'd like to ask you, Simpiwe. It speaks to the whole issue of blended finance and the role that DFIs and other institutions such as yourself can play in structuring financial products or financial solutions that can, potentially de-risk and ultimately crowd in private capital, and blending private concessional and public finances to actually drive investment in this. I think in relation to that, what then do you see your role as a DFI in maintaining momentum, crowding in private capital, and what sort of potential, let's call it funding mechanisms, funding platforms, do you think could be relevant in order to unlock some of these opportunities?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think maybe before I start with that question, let me just add one dimension on the topic around private sector and regional power participation. So I wanted to just touch on the point of liberalization, which is a topic that I hope we will touch on a bit later. For an example, we funded a client that operates in a liberalized market where you've got one side of the market that's regulated and another that's not regulated, where there are bilateral PPAs basically between independent power producers and clients. This particular client was able to develop its fleet of power plants, and the particular government of that country wasn't necessarily looking at that client to provide power for the entire sector. But what it then did is they developed into a point where when the next door country was in need of power, they were able to sign a PPA, being based in this country, but supplying power to next door. And obviously, the existence of the regional power pools pretty much facilitated that. So it's one of the points where over and above the different financing instruments and so on, liberalizing the market, it does have a very wide role in terms of ensuring that we end up extending the role of IPPs in terms of providing power. Now, going into the role of DFIs, right? I see the role of DFIs being taking a value chain approach where DFIs play a meaningful role in the entire project development value chain, starting from your planning of infrastructure, putting together your infrastructure plans, and then in the implementation stage, you then pull from those plans programs that enable, for an example, your transparent procurement, bankable contracting frameworks, and then you move from there to the actual project preparation of projects where you provide funding for feasibility studies. And then you move from that and you then are able to provide your execution funding where you can play a role from a blended finance perspective, whether as a DFI you take your longer tenors or your subordinated structure such that you are able to pull the entire financing structure to be bankable. Practical examples from a DBSA perspective. In the planning space, we support a lot of the municipalities, and then moving into your project or program development, DBSA supported the IPP office. I mean, there's investment to the tune of above 270 billion that went into that. But the interesting thing is, I mean, in the continent, we always say there are a lot of projects, right? But there aren't a lot of bankable projects. But if you look at the South African IPP program, because of the facilitation and the creation of that program, the private sector funding was able to be there for feasibility projects. As an example, you don't find project developers looking around for project preparation or project development funding in the South African context, because as a DFI, we were there to incubate and to support the IPP office to create this platform and the framework that enabled your developers to put in the project development funding, which is risk capital, right? And once they have been awarded the project, they're able to implement. And then obviously the role we play as well is to provide the project feasibility funding. And as I stated as well, we play in the role of providing those long tenors and those subordinated structures to ensure that financing structures are bankable.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Sim. I think the point that both panelists raised was the fact that you need bankable projects. And for bankable projects, you need offtake. And I mean, the IPP office has provided for very clear offtake models, procurement models, that has ultimately realized the success that we've seen in bringing in risk capital to drive from a development side of things into execution and ultimately what we're seeing right now, which is a very robust renew IPP sector within the South African context. I think, Bernard, to you, and that again leads well into what you as the IPP office and the successes that you've achieved over the past decade or so. What do you think has been the feature of, or some of the key features of this procurement model that has enabled us to create the sort of successes that we've seen from this office?
Yeah, so I think maybe let's touch on some of these achievements that you're referring to. So, I mean, as we speak now, the program has delivered over 80 gigawatts of capacity. 7.2 gigawatts is renewables, and then there's 1 gigawatt of open cycle gas turbines. And on an annual basis, we're getting close to 10%, if not more, of the actual energy coming from IPPs, which is a significant achievement for South Africa. And at the same time, we have seen competition growing, and somebody mentioned the bankability of projects. As we speak today, there's over 100 gigawatts of projects at different pipeline stages in South Africa today. I had yesterday up to 60 gigawatt is almost ready, shovel ready to bid in any of the programs, whether it's us or the private sector. But I think what really created this space for South Africa, it's a number of factors. But somebody spoke about the enabling environment for funding. So I call this the IPP energy ecosystem that we managed to create in South Africa. And if you really look at what that means, it actually starts with government. The government has been fully supportive of the IPP space in South Africa, from all the permitting and authorizations, which are things that other countries are still battling with. So here, if you want to develop your projects, starting from land acquisition, I can almost guarantee you, within 18 to 2 years, you will have all your permitting done. You will have your grid connection. It might cost you because the grid is not readily available. So I think that ecosystem, when we started in 2010, we brought in all the skills that we needed to put together those transactions. But today, I mean, I'm running the program with 100% South Africans transaction advisory team. And I'm talking up to 50 people that are involved in each and every program. So that ecosystem, the lending of funding of these projects from commercial banks, DFIs, pension funds, and what I see now with the CNI space, it's actually plug and play. To a point that I look at some of the PPAs, I'm like, but this looks like my PPA. So that, for me, that's ecosystem. And we are sharing this experience with the rest of the continent, which I think it's the right thing to do. And then over and above that ecosystem, you mentioned the buyer. Eskom has been, I mean, they've never defaulted on payments, which is one of the experience that we have seen in some areas where the model failed. National Treasury, the government guarantee behind the IPP program has been, I don't think without it we would even have been able to take off this program. We are now slowly reducing the government guarantee because the market has matured to a point that we believe that given the liberalization that's coming, we should be able to bank this project with less or even no government guarantee going forward. And we are seeing the same happening in the private sector as well. So there's been a number of factors, and another key one for me is really rand-denominated PPAs, which is something very not common in the continent. And if one looks at the impact of the rand, had we not done that, the rand has depreciated, I think 50%, if not more, in the last 10, 12 years that we've been running the program. So the tariff that you see today would have been, 50% or more by now. So a number of factors contributed, but I think that ecosystem for me, which we are now transferring it to the private sector, and it's probably going into the liberalization as well, is the one that carried us along, and I think it will drive us into the liberalization space as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you.
I may continue on what he's saying.
Yes, please do.
From another aspect. Maybe
Please
South
do.
Africa is lucky to have you over here, but we've seen other problems in other smaller countries, that they don't have today enough energy. And I was giving you an example without mentioning the country itself, but we have in a country X a small reservoir today of natural gas. Their generation capacity is very limited, not more than 100 megawatt, but they have the gas. Yeah, they have the gas. They have some of the consumption for the mining sector as well. But the problem is to build up an IPP, it was very complicated because you have the upstreamer who want to sell a specific quantity of natural gas. But today, the consumption of the electricity that they have actually in the country is not more than 20% of the capacity of the small reservoir that they already have. So, and we've stepped in. We were interested, we collaborated with an upstreamer to take the gas out, but okay, the upstreamer told us, okay, I will get the gas out, I will give it to you as TOCA to invest in the generation of electricity. And say, okay, we're ready. He said, but the current existing generation capacity that we have is not more than 100 megawatts, so we need to build another 300 to 400 megawatt. But then the country and the electricity company said, yes, we will need the 400 megawatt within the next 5 years, but you will need to put every year 100 megawatt. I hope you're following up with the numbers. So we have the gas, but the problem of the upstreamer that they cannot, based on that, it is a small reservoir for natural gas, and based on the capacity of the investment that we put, they couldn't divide it. So they said, okay, but we need to take out the 100 million scarf day from first day. And then you will need to find a way. And then we went to the electricity company and said, oh, yes, we need within the next 5 years. But then we went to the government and said, okay, but we will need something that they will take all the gas and they want to deliver the 100 million scarf at a time for the purpose of putting a processing plant and everything. So they need to take it out. And this is the quantity they need yearly. And up till now, we couldn't reach an agreement. We even had the proposal. So this is our problems. Maybe you have the sovereign guarantee. Maybe you can have other things that are on the table that will help you. But the problem is not, and this is not a problem of a specific country. I would estimate that this is a problem of at least 10 to 15 countries. That they don't have, because if we had like 5, 6, 7 producers of electricity over there, so we would have taken the natural gas to several facilities. But the problem, you have only one facility that is producing electricity in the country, and then it's very hard. Yeah, it's very, unless I wouldn't leave you without an answer, but unless we collaborated between different small African countries together, we put hands together. It's not every country in South Africa or in Africa is like South Africa or Egypt or even Algeria or Morocco or it's that there are small countries that they need to put hands together, and we need all together to put a solution to overcome such obstacles. So yeah.
No, fantastic. Thank you for that. And I do think it really was a question that I had that was going to flow on from Bernard's question, which really was around your experience in relation to perhaps the African context outside of South Africa or outside some of the more sophisticated markets that potentially has the market scale that can enable it, right? And I think the point that you raised is a very interesting point, which is you sometimes have different energy systems that have to work together. Gas working with electricity, and so how do you tie in contracting regimes that matches what the gas system operator would require with what the electricity system operator requires, which is really the challenge of South Africa and why South Africa has been unable to get their gas IPP program off the ground because of these dynamics. And so I think, to your point as well, the opportunity for regional integration again comes up. So I think there are some recurring themes that are quite useful from this. I think I'm going to reverse the direction now and stay with you, Adli, in that we've spoken about this context. We've spoken about where we are. As a private investor, right, what interests you? Where are you going to be placing your capital in the energy sector over the next 5-10 years?
Sovereign guarantee.
Sovereign guarantee.
So sovereign guarantee was a solid off-taker, because I don't want to put my money in a project where I will not be able to get my funds, even if I have a sovereign guarantee. It's not just, we're Africans and we invest in Africa and we want to develop Africa. So I would be looking for a solid off-taker first, that they have real work on the ground, and then a sovereign guarantee. I would require a reliable infrastructure. I guess that's the most important part to put the money in, and any investor or because we're having most of the funds sitting with us on the panel. So I think that's the most important part for an investor to step in and do an investment. Other than this, everything is easy.
A credit-worthy sovereign also, so a sovereign that, no, but I think that's valuable, and I think that's noted. I think when we're thinking also, and coming back to one of the points that Marilyn made earlier, and this question is now going to be directed to you, Bernard. We've now seen a significant amount of independent generating capacity come online. But we've kind of maxed out our ability to connect them to the grid, specifically within the South African context. And so we're now seeing, well, there has to be significant additional investment that has to go into, let's call it the adjacent components, your transmission infrastructure and so on and so forth. So when we think about your independent, power transmission sort of scenarios, where I think within the South African context we're talking of about 300 billion odd. Yeah. What do you think will need to be done from a grid infrastructure perspective, and bringing in private capital to actually enhance our grid infrastructure? And what are some of the models available to us to drive that?
Yeah, so that's the biggest question that we all have in this space in South Africa. So maybe just to give a bit of context around the grid. I've mentioned that there is over 100 gigawatts of capacity that we desperately need that is waiting for the grid. Between now and 2032, we need to build 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines. We currently have 32,000 kilometers that we built in the last 100 years since 1921 when ESCOM was formed. So we need to build half of what we build in 100 years in the next 8 years. That's the context.
The order of the challenge.
That's a challenge.
It's a huge challenge. And if you go back in the last 20, I spent 20 years in ESCOM transmission, and I don't think we built more than 400, the best year, more than 400 kilometers in 1 year. So now we need to build 1,400 in every year. So I think there is an appreciation that transmission alone cannot execute this. And there are a number of models that are being looked at, and they will build parts of the 14,000 kilometers, but there is appreciation that there need to be an augmentation from the private sector, and that's the work that's ongoing. We are also party to the discussions together with National Treasury and Transmission, and to try and find which is the best model. But some of the options being considered is build, operate, transfer, and this is quite prevalent in the South America, in particular Brazil and Chile, and all it means is that for X number of years, 15, 20, 25 years, there's a concession. It could be backed up with a government guarantee, and then the private sector can build a piece of line with substations, and within that period, it's similar to what we do in the IPP space. You pay for capacity payment based on availability, and then with returns, of course, and then at the end of the concession period, that line gets handed over to transmission. Transmission lines can last up to 60 years. We have lines that are over 50 years old. So you get this asset paid for in 20 years, and then it gets handed over. So it's a no-brainer, and I think that's the model that is likely to be adopted in South Africa. It really makes perfect sense if we want to make sure that we drive this transmission build to achieve the targets that we need. We cannot survive without this. The fact of the matter is that although we don't have load shedding today, by 2035, we need to decommission 15 to 20 gigawatt of coal. South Africa demand is 30 gigawatt today. So more than half of that will be replaced by renewables. And renewables, we know you need 4 or 5 times that capacity that you're replacing of base load. So we don't have an option. We need to build transmission. It has to be a combination of private and public sector. The model that we've been running can be adopted, not like for like, but if I look at the battery IPP program that we just signed the agreements last month, it's exactly the same thing. Pay for capacity based on availability, and concession of X number of years, and then it's a transfer.
Fantastic, thank you. I think the points that you're raising are existential to an extent in nature, right? Because even though we've come out of touch wood, come out of a prolonged period of load shedding through improved generation performance from Eskom, I think your decommissioning point is a very valid point, and there is a decommissioning schedule, and to do that we really have to step up the rollout of transmission infrastructure at scale that we've never really seen before. And how do we do that? Well, we have to crowd in, and we crowd in private capital with the right sort of models. I think staying on that point, I do want to come to you, Marilyn, because you were the one who effectively opened up this this topic. Before I come to you, Simpiwe, is around the whole transmission sector in particular. From a World Bank perspective or from a DFI perspective, we see that there is an urgent and pressing need in order to drive that. What would you say are some of the levers available in order to build out some of the, let's call it, adjacent to generation components of the energy and electricity value chains? What can be done in order to unlock greater private participation?
Thank you, Hasnayn. And I'm glad that I actually opened this Pandora box in a way, because I'm not going to bring anything new. I think we have already discussed it. But what I wanted to brag a little bit is that the World Bank not only talking the talk, but also walking the talk. And we are bringing the South Africa experience, and I hope that we are not only bringing the financing, which is a big part of it, but also trying to support with the studies, with research, with TA. And those three elements that I mentioned earlier remain. It's definitely enabling environment, it's policy and regulations. Sometimes we get a little upset and disappointed with the pace of reforms, but to be very honest, I mean, I think we have to give the credit where it's due. When you zoom out, countries like South Africa, the pace of the reforms is really, really phenomenal, I have to admit. In that process, however, Adli talked about sovereign guarantees and what he needs as a private sector. And again, coming back to these annual meetings, we had several discussions with the global investors, with the funds, with philanthropies. And there is no issue with lack of financing. The financing is there. I mean, the BlackRock has been talking that they have an assets under the management of 18 trillion, which is like incomprehensible. And then, so there is not an issue with the financing, but rather making sure that this enabling environment is there. The guarantees, yes, do work, the sovereign guarantees, but even those have certain limits. And I think when I say that we engage it, we're basically trying to be engaged in all the three elements. One is policy and regulations. We're talking about the least cost planning to be in place and provide that clarity, long-term clarity of where the country or the region goes. Second is offtake. We're talking about utilities, and it's kind of the whole slew of reforms. It's talking about the efficiency of the operations. It's making sure that the financial systems are in place, taking into account the challenge of affordability, and ensuring that there are subsidies and support to the poor. And the third part is the pipeline. Again, the preparing and providing the contextual financing to help prepare the feasibilities, environmental studies, social studies, the whole this part of the just energy transition that requires a huge amount of concessional financing that we are supporting. And then I'm glad that this IPT office, we're also helping South Africa to try to set it up to ensure that this is something where South Africa is actually opening new path that I very much hope that can be then replicated throughout Africa. And the ultimate goal is not about all of those kind of collectively. The ultimate goal is that we bring that that energy to reliably and sustainably to the population. And it's kind of, when we talk about that, if we keep the business as usual, more than 650 million of people in sub-Saharan Africa will remain in dark by 2030, which is unacceptable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Mirla. Going back to you, Simphiwe, you touched on something a bit earlier around market liberalization. And I think I want to kind of bring it full circle to that point. We spoke a lot about South Africa and some of the successes that South Africa had. Adli mentioned some of the areas that perhaps haven't been so successful in relation to, or some of the challenges he's faced or they've faced or has been faced on the continent. With your exposure both to the South African market, but also in your role at DBSA in relation to the rest of Africa coverage that you undertake, what do you think some of the key considerations need to be in order to replicate some of these successes that can be taken out into the rest of the continent? And then perhaps touching on the points that the key trends that you highlighted in the beginning around market liberalization.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think the liberalization part of the South African market, we heard that there's over 60 gigawatts of projects that are shovel ready. And basically, this is just from essentially last year of when the liberalization happened. And it's essentially a trend that we will, if we don't go the situation will force us into that direction. Quick example on Ghana. Ghana is quite matured in this space. The client I was talking to earlier, by the way, is based in Ghana. They now provide about 10% of the reliable capacity in the country, providing power to the blue chip gold mining companies. In the process of that, it also enabled them to be a gas infrastructure owner, as an example. They own more than 400 kilometers of pipeline in that country. And to top it, now they're supplying power to Cote d'Ivoire. So this is something that, if we don't embrace it, the situation will force us. And really, liberalization happens in different formats. For an example, in the likes of Cote d'Ivoire and Gabon, they've liberalized and privatized the actual collection and payment of PPAs or payments to IPPs, basically. That has been privatized. So you find that your private customers, which are prepaid, because essentially what makes a sector bankable is the customers pay. So if you are able to ring fence that and ensure that those payments are made to IPPs, what it tends to do, it also alleviates the necessity for a government guarantee, as an example, and perhaps just a PRI cover, just in case the government comes in and basically messes up with that structure. So that's essentially some of the things I think we can. There are a number of examples in the continent. It's not just South Africa. We need to look around and sort of take those lessons and make sure that they spread throughout the continent.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Simphiwe. I think to bring it back to you, Carlos. We've spoken on the demand side of the equation. Began with the demand side of the equation, recognizing what the long-term evolution is going to be in relation to that. But largely from an investment side of things, the investors will come on both the supply as well as potentially the infrastructure side of things. From an opportunity, and perhaps just to close off here, from an opportunity set perspective, as a private participant looking to meaningfully participate in the sector, where would you say the key opportunities lie? What would the private sector need to do in order to participate meaningfully? And perhaps a final point in relation to this, what do you potentially see the scope as being for strategic partnerships from a private-public partnership perspective in order to drive some of these successes?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of points have been raised that are key to this answer. There's already been a lot of interest from international developers to invest in Africa and also from the financing side. So as it's already been raised, it's more about finding the bankable projects, because if you look at companies like Total Energies or Scatec, they have a huge pipeline of projects that they're wanting to develop, but they're looking for the right conditions. And maybe the market liberalization will help to some extent. But when we're talking about renewable energy projects, they will mostly continue to be developed with power purchase agreements, right? So then it's finding the right conditions for these power purchase agreements, and then I think most of the points to be able to sign this project, these agreements has been raised. Like, we need clear policies. We need also access to financing, but then the risk of currencies, for example. Most of this financing is done in dollars, but then you're selling the power in local currencies, so then maybe providing some guarantees through that to reduce the risk. And then the credit worthiness of the off-takers, I think, is also key to be able to sign the deals to commercialize the power. So I think if we focus on these three main areas, then we will be able to attract the investment that is necessary, that there's already a huge pipeline of projects that is just waiting to take decision. And maybe just one additional point would be on the, the whole value chain of the projects has been mentioned, but maybe something that has been left out is the manufacturing of all this equipment, for example. So attracting the manufacturing of solar panels, of windmills into the continent, because then with this you're also reducing part of the risk of the investments, and you're providing better prices for the projects.
Fantastic, thank you. I think the discussion has been fascinating. I think we are coming to the end of this particular session. I think we spoke quite extensively around the enabling environment required for us to ultimately bank successful projects, beginning with the project pipeline that you have and the quality set of projects that are in your pipeline, and taking it through ultimately to bankability, where you need that market, that off-taker with that can guarantee or secure that ultimately lender's agreement that can enable and bank the projects in an environment that is energy hungry and will continue to be energy hungry into the future. I think perhaps one of the points which I think I may have alluded to but not have gotten specifically is, we've spoken about IPPs, but I think part of the energy transition has meant that with the addition of renewables, not all energy carriers or energy sources ultimately serve the same purpose. And so how do we balance it off such that we have grid stability from a generation perspective? And I think, where we may have been very successful around renewables in particular, other forms such as natural gas, you touched upon battery storage, and I think in the future, hydrogen and so on and so forth are some of the other interesting components that would need to be thought about. But that is potentially for another day. Colleagues, thank you very much for your time and attention this late in the afternoon. We really do appreciate it, and I think if you could all give our panelists a round of applause, that would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the day here in this venue. Really do appreciate it. Tomorrow we again will be reconvening here for conversations of impact. Thank you to all our discussants and interlocutors that participated in the panels today. Really do appreciate it. My name is Oliver Dixon, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Cheers.